Chapter 18 Jason's Gold. The sound of a gunshot, close by, exploded by the oppressive silence. The husky came instantly to his feet, ears at the alert. With King at his side, Jason hobbled outside the cabin to investigate, but there was no one around. He hollered himself hoarse. No one was there. The hair on the back of his neck rose. He was scared down to the roots of his chattering teeth. The oppressive, almost palpable silence closed back in. Winter abhorred sound. There was only the emptiness of the vast northern forest. The next day, 2 more gunshots, almost certainly coming from the cottonwoods along the creek. Again, silence and no tracks in the snow. No one had been there. It must be the trees themselves, Jason realized, bursting and splitting in the extreme cold. He used to pride himself on being able to go out alone, to shake off his bouts of loneliness. No longer. Thank God for King. This place would have already made him crazy with terror if it weren't for the husky. In the mornings, every nailhead on the inside of the cabin was covered with hoarfrost. It took time for the little sheet iron stove to push back the cold. One day, behind the cabin, he discovered a rusty thermometer nailed to a spruce tree. Midday, the mercury was registering 25 degrees below zero. He had to spend hours outside now, making firewood, though every swing of the axe reverberated his ribs. And he had to keep open the hole in the creek where Henderson has been drawing water with the bucket. The husky was always eager to go out, bite the snow, roll in it. Jason was still awed by the bitter cold, even though he bundled himself thick as a bear to go out. He'd never known what cold was before, not really. Here in the north it seemed an element of all its own, a pervasive and lethal liquid pouring down out of the sky. Though he was getting by from one day to the next, the idea of wintering here was incomprehensible. On the last day of October, according to the Nix, he was carving on the cabin wall, he thought he'd heard voices from downriver. He told himself that the voices were coming from the dark corners of his imagination. He heard them again, shouts, people shouting, and this time not far away. You've lost your mind, he told himself. But King was growling. Jason started to get up. King began barking. Suddenly the door shook with loud blows. Abruptly the door was pulled open. There stood a man with cracked lips, a frostbitten white patch at the tip of his nose, icicles in his mustache, and eyes wide like a refuge from an asylum. As the man lowered his heavy pack to the ground and bent to unbuckle his snowshoes, he stammered about something about the cabin. Was this the owner of the cabin, come to claim it? 7 or 8 more men under heavy burdens were trudging toward the cabin. 7 or 8 more men under heavy burdens were trudging toward the cabin, mechanically like sleepwalkers. The last was pulling someone on a sled, someone propped up against a pack sack. Would they demand he give up the cabin? With a glance back toward the figure on the sled, the man at his door barked, "Get him inside." It was a boy on the sled, no older than 12. He tried to look past Jason into the cabin. The boy's face was a mask of fright, as if he was being led to his execution. 4 men struggled to carry the boy inside. "Watch that foot," one of them cried out. Too late, as the boy's right foot, wrapped in a blanket, bumped up against the doorframe. Jason expected the boy to howl in pain, but there came no reaction at all. The blanket fell away, revealing a foot and a lower leg, massively swollen and covered with only a heavy sock. Jason looked to the leader for an explanation. "Do you have any whiskey?" the man demanded. His eyes were jittery and his voice as brittle as glass. Jason shook his head. "Probably wouldn't do much good anyways. Lay Charlie down on the floor there, right here in the middle of the floor where we can hold him down." "For the love of God, Uncle George," the boy cried. "Who's going to do it?" The boy's uncle was looking widely around the room at the faces of the men who crowded into the cabin. All eyes were averted as they stamped their feet and pushed to get close to the warmth of the stove. "Henry, you're a blacksmith." "Aye, a blacksmith, not a butcher." "He's your nephew, McGuire," another man growled. "It will heal, Uncle George," the boy begged. "Give it time." The boy's uncle knelt and began to unroll a large wool sock. A cloying stench wafted across the room and nearly knocked Jason down. Men cursed and reached for bandanas or handkerchiefs, which they pressed to their mouths and noses. All eyes fell on the dead limb, and the room was filled with revulsion. The boy's right foot and lower leg were horribly distended and blackened with rotting tissue. The boy himself, on seeing it, shrank in horror and wailed, "No, no." The word gangrene was spoken, and Jason heard another voice whisper, "The poison's probably spread already." McGuire stoked the stove full from the pile of kindling there, then opened the draft slot wide. The kindling caught with a roar, and within minutes the thin walls of the stove were glowing bright red. "Whose knife is razor sharp?" he demanded. A man with a walrus mustache produced a broad bowie knife from the scabbard at his hip. "Maybe you should use the saw," another man put in, indicating the crosscut saw that Henderson had left behind. "Give me both, then. That pail of water. Let's put it on to boil." The boy's eyes, as he laid splayed on the floor, seemed to have rolled back into his skull. He was deathly pale, and his chest was heaving with fright. His uncle's eyes were searching the room. They came to rest on a short-handled shovel hanging from the cabin wall. "Stick the blade of the shovel into the stove, Henry. I need it red hot." "What for?" "To seal the stump so he doesn't bleed to death. Give me that stick there, Johnson, for between his teeth so he doesn't bite his tongue off. Don't any of you leave. I want all of you here to help him hold him down." Jason wiped his forehead. He'd broken out into a cold sweat. Quickly, he pulled on his magna and oilskin overcoat, put on his fur hat and mittens, and backed out the door. Outside, Jason reeled away from the cabin, wading in the knee-drop snow with the husky following behind. He had to get away. He walked upstream toward the Five Fingers, along the windward side of the Yukon's bank where the snow was crusted stiff. When he thought he'd gone far enough that he wouldn't possibly hear, he crumpled in the snow and held the dog close. The first scream carried far in this extreme cold, and Jason heard it distinctly, all the more horrible for the distance it had traveled. Though Jason clasped his mittens to his ears, he continued to hear the boy's torment worse than he had ever imagined from souls cast into hell. The husky, too, recoiled from the sound of the screams. At first his ears lay down flat. Then he yawned anxiously, and then he whimpered. Jason broke into tears. He heard about battlefield surgery during the Civil War. Once he asked his father how men could have endured it. His father had answered laconically, they had no choice. After a minute, the forest and undulating frozen field of white that was the river were again swathed with the eerie silence of winter. Had the boy blacked out? Had he bled to death? For long minutes Jason stayed where he was, dreading to return. Yet he had to find out what the men intended to do. If it was their cabin, or if they were moving in regardless, he was in bad trouble. To Jason's surprise, as he neared the cabin, the men were already underway, bent under their heavy pack-sacks and moving upriver fast in their snowshoes. The boy's uncle, rifle across his chest, was in the lead as before. The sled and the boy were nowhere to be seen. Jason stood in their path. As they approached and halted in front of him, he sputtered, "Is he dead, then?" "Alive, but he lost a lot of blood," the boy's wide-eyed uncle explained. "Out cold. He'll likely die. You're leaving without him?" "We have no choice. We can't wait him out." "But where are you going? Where did you come from?" The man's eyes blazed with panicky fire. "We've no time for talk and explanations. Lost too much time already." "You can't leave him behind." "We have no choice," McGuire repeated. "It was Charlie's bad luck he froze his foot, and there's nothing can undo that." "You can't leave him." The man brandished his rifle. "Get out of my way." "You don't understand. I don't have the grub to feed myself. What have you left to feed him, if he lives?" The man's face went apoplectic with fury. He brandished the rifle again. King growled deep in his throat. "Don't you understand?" McGuire said. "We have nothing to give you. We only have what's on our backs. With 250 miles to go, and every day shorter than the last. Now move aside, or I'll shoot you where you stand. Put him out in the cold if you must." Jason hesitated, scarcely believing what he just heard. Then he stepped aside. None of them, as they passed by, would look him in the eye. In shame, they trudged mechanically upriver like the walking dead.